My sermon this morning is really not so much a sermon as it's really a work in progress. Now, I've never really tried this before, always aiming to be definitive about things when I come up to the pulpit. So I hope you will forgive me and just let go and simply join me for the ride. I want to explore a field of ethics that was first put on the table by Aristotle some 2,300 years ago, but it's enjoying a bit of a resurgence these days. Now, ethics has always been a challenging discipline for me, not because I feel I lead an unethical life, but because judgments about what is right or wrong require justification beyond what your guts may tell you. And then there's often a chasm between what you know is right and how you actually live your life. For example, when Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a student at Union Seminary in New York, safe from the horrors of Nazi Germany, he went back to Germany to join the resistance movement because he felt it was the right thing to do. His professor, Reinhold Niebuhr, told the class that Bonhoeffer certainly got an A in ethical living, but then he asked the other students, how would you grade yourselves? In other words, are your ethical principles really a part of your life? We find ourselves these days awash in many conflicting ethical views. It's almost classic, a textbook example of two major ethical theories clashing with each other. We have utilitarianism on the one hand, motivated to provide the best balance of pleasure over pain, in a moral dilemma in which one must make the so-called right decision. The utilitarian will choose the one that will bring about the greatest happiness for the greatest number. The theory is frankly appealing because all we need to do is quantify our judgment. How much pleasure or how much pain for how many people will be produced by a given action or policy? The ethical theory that maintains right actions are not quantifiable is called the formalist theory. The formalism, appeals mostly to liberal sensibilities. In fact, I would argue that our 7 UU principles are rooted in formalist ethical theory, which acknowledges the existence of certain bonds among people. It resonates with the Confucian ideas we heard in our reading this morning, that we simply have obligations to one another because that's how the social order works. Thus, the formalists looks at contexts in which moral judgments arise. The ethical formalist will examine interpersonal relations as key to decision-making with an eye out always to improve relations among people by increasing trust, honesty, and respect among all people. So rather than basing a moral decision on the math, where more people benefit than are hurt, the formalist cares more about the very fabric of society woven by the human obligations we have towards one another. So once we understand utilitarian ideas of morality as distinct from formalist views, then we can see, for example, how the Trayvon Martin case triggers such enormously different emotional responses. The utilitarian remains convinced that stand your ground law ultimately benefits far more people than it hurts. The accused aggressor, George Zimmerman, acted within the law, which permitted him to use force because Trayvon looked suspicious. In the long run, such action saves more lives than it hurts. It serves a greater good, allowing more people to feel safe. The formalist will contend that an egregious violation of our obligations to one another took place in that failed shooting. The ties among people, however tenuous, were completely destroyed by this heinous, violent act. You know, much of the same reasoning can be said for racial profiling by police in major metropolitan areas. Now, if you want to do numbers, crime is reportedly down in urban areas as a result, say police chiefs, of stopping and frisking minority youth. More people receive a good outcome than are harmed by police stops. But, the formalist will argue, look at the erosion of trust that this creates among people. Don't we have an obligation within the human community to treat and respect all people equally? Either quantifying your moral decisions or fostering good human relations represents opposing ways people justify their behavior. Individuals and groups make moral claims for their behavior all the time. Proposition 8 ran as a totally moral issue. Ethics wants to know on what grounds these claims are made, what reasons are offered for them. Now, most Unitarian Universalists, like all good ethical formalists, will contend that Proposition 8 proved destructive to the human fabric, ignoring our obligations for justice to be applied to all people. Most of our issues today result from different ethical justifications. Affordable health care or securing the social safety net can either be quantified, where more people are helped than those who suffer, or we can examine the obligations we hold in the social contract, where we must sacrifice a little for the common good. Greg Smith, the former employee, I must stress former employee, at Goldman Sachs, who worked there for 12 years before spilling the beans about Goldman in the New York Times editorial last month, resigned because of the lack of integrity in the company. Goldman Sachs made a lot of folks wealthy. But for Greg Smith, it was not just about the money, but advising clients what he thought was right for them, even if it meant less money for the firm. Goldman Sachs' culture was to influence clients to buy stocks that the firm was trying to get rid of because they were seen as not having a lot of potential profit. Now, morally, the firm was doing what every other Wall Street firm does: earn as much money for the company as possible without overtly breaking the laws. But Greg Smith didn't like the math, and so he left as his only recourse to improving the quality of personal interactions. And this reminds me a little of a Congregationalist colleague of mine back in Boston who made a lot of money as a stockbroker and then felt a little bit guilty about this, and the way he assuaged his guilt was, of course, by becoming ordained as a Congregationalist minister in his mid-50s. But it always was a little odd. As dedicated and committed as he was to social justice, he would always drive up to protests and demonstrations in his Mercedes. Jim, I don't think you quite get it, and that's kind of what I'd say to Mitt Romney as well. It's tough to appeal to the common man if you've got a certain kind of wealth behind you. Now, we see opposing ethical views played out in environmental issues like drilling for oil and extending our dependency on fossil fuels will benefit more people than not, conveniently justified by denying long-term harm. Formalists argue on behalf of the relationship between us and the planet, that the community of concern extends more widely than allowing people to drive cars inexpensively. But utilitarian ethicists, weighing the costs and rewards of jobs versus saving the spotted owl or whales or any number of extinct species, cannot remotely understand environmentalists. Environmentalists justify protecting Earth and non-human species over creating new jobs through a concern not only for the welfare of the human community, but they extend the social contract to include trees and wilderness and oceans and birds and creepy insects. All sentient beings do not figure in utilitarian calculations. The meaning of ethics has been largely reduced to understanding how we ought or ought not act. Utilitarian ethicists tend to look at consequences of actions, whether they produce the greatest good for the greatest number, where good is usually defined as happiness or the absence of suffering. By contrast, the formalist ethicist maintains that some actions are inherently wrong regardless of their consequences. For example, torture is always wrong. It violates the obligation we have towards one another. Dick Cheney argued, however, that torture was justified because it yielded a good outcome for the American people.